Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Python for Absolute Beginners series. In this episode, we're going to cover loops. Loops basically allow us to repeat some code over and over again until we decide to stop it. Python has two types of loops that we'll discuss in today's episode. So I mentioned in previous episodes that variables and conditionals are like the bread and butter behind Python, but loops are what makes programming powerful. With 2 lines of code, I could print every number from 0 to 100,000. We're going to go ahead and jump right into the code this episode. The first type of loop that we have is called a for loop. And we call it that because we always start these kinds of loops with the word for. I'm going to go ahead and write out a simple for loop here, and I'll explain what each part of it does. So let's write for x in range, parentheses, and we'll do 0, 10. Then I'm going to write a colon after this to indent, and I'm just going to write print x. Okay, so now let me break this down. So if I run this code, you'll see it should outprint all the numbers from 0 to 9. So when writing a for loop, we always start it with the word for. Our goal with this loop is to print out every number between 0 and 10. So we need a variable that can represent each individual element, and that's where this x comes in. This basically means that we are representing each individual number with the variable x. So with the first iteration of the loop, x is equal to 0. And then the next iteration, it's equal to 1. Then the next one, it's equal to 2, and so forth. This variable name can be literally whatever we want. It just needs to follow the variable naming conventions that we discussed in episode 2. Then we have this in range component here. And this range of numbers is the range of numbers that we're iterating over in our loop. So this first number within the range parentheses should be the number that you want to start at, and this second number should be the one you want to end at. I'll make a quick note here that this second number is not included in the range, but it'll print everything up to that number. That's why if you see when this code is run, it prints everything up to 9, but then it doesn't actually print 10 because it doesn't include this number. So if I wanted to print everything including the number 10, I'd have to make this actually 11. If you run that, you'll see it prints that, and then 10 is added here to the end. So I'll go ahead and change this number back to a 10 here. And altogether, this statement is basically saying, let's look at every number between 0 and 10. And at every number, we're going to execute some block of code. The code that is executed at every single block depends on what is indented underneath this for statement. So in our example, we're simply printing out every single number. Note that we set x to represent each individual element, so when we write our print statement, we're just printing out x. This line containing the for statement is generally called the loop header, and whatever is indented underneath is generally called the loop body. So let's trace this loop step by step once I press run. So once I press run, we hit this first line here. So first we set up a range of numbers 0 to 10, and then we set x equal to the first number in the range. So at the very first iteration, x gets set to 0. So then we enter this block of indented code, and we just print out x, so we print out 0. Then we go back up to the loop header, and now we set x equal to 1. We enter the body again and print out x, which is equal to 1. Then we go back up, x is equal to 2, then we print out 2, go back up, x is equal to 3, then print out 3, and so forth. And we do that up until we hit x equals 10, because 10 is the last number in this range. But because it's the last number, once it hits 10, we don't enter the body, so that's why 9 is the last number that is actually printed out in this series. In our case, we're just printing out the item in the range, but we can have as many lines as we want, and we can do literally whatever we want with inside the loop body. So above this for loop, I'm going to make a new variable, call it count. And I'm going to set this equal to 0. And basically what I want to do is at every iteration of the loop, I want to add 3 to count. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this print statement here. I'm going to write this statement here. So we're going to do count equals count plus 3. Now what this statement is essentially saying is take the existing value of count, add 3 to it, and then update it. So this is the new value of count. So what's going to happen is we started at 0 once the program starts, and then at the first iteration of the loop, we're going to add 3 to it. So count is now equal to 3. Then we're going to go to the next iteration, add 3 to it, now it's equal to 6. Go to the next iteration, add 3 more, now it's equal to 9, and so forth. And this might look a little confusing here, the fact that we have 2 variables of the same name in the same statement here, but just know that this is what we're updating it to, and this is the existing value of count. So we're just taking the existing value and adding 3 more to it. And what I want to do here is after the loop is done, I want to go ahead and just write a print statement and print count. And if you look at this loop, you can take a guess that the output for count should be 30, right? Because we go through this loop 10 times, and at every single time we add 3. So if I run this, you'll see it prints out 30 for count. And on a quick little side tangent here, there's actually another way you can write this line here without writing it like this, because this looks a little bit awkward, right? So if we want to just increment a number or a variable by 3, we can also just do count plus equals 3. And these lines literally mean the exact same thing. This is just a shorthand notation way of writing it. So if I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out and run it again, you'll see we still get 30 because this line is basically the equivalent of this line. It's just a shorter way of writing it. It's a little more convenient, a little more widely used. I'm going to go ahead and just delete this commented line out here so we can have it written like this. And remember when I said at the start of the video that I could print out every number from 0 to 100,000 in 2 lines of code? Well, let's do that so I can show you. So I'll go ahead and delete this count variable here, and I'll delete this print, and let's just change this back to where we had it before. So we'll do just print x. I'll go ahead and clear this output here. So I said we want to do every number from 0 to 100,000. So let's change this range to 0 to 100,000. And then let's run it and let's see what happens. And as you can see, it is literally printing out to the console every single number from 0 to 100,000. So if you were to try to do this on paper from 0 to 100,000, that would take you maybe a few hours, maybe even longer. But in Python, we can do this in about, let's say, 20 to 30 seconds, which is awesome. So I'll let this finish running here. And bam, now it's finished. We've just printed every single number from 0 to 100,000, and it did that in 32 seconds. And this is what I meant when I said loops are what makes programming powerful. Okay, so let's keep this moving. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this output here, and I'm going to clear up this code block because I want to go over a new concept. And what I want to go over now is another way that we can use for loops. So this syntax will look a little bit different, but it's going to involve what we learned about list in our last episode. So let's say we have a list and we'll call it my list. And let's just set it equal to a list that we had last episode. So we had something like oranges, we had apples, and then we had grapes. So we went over last video how to do all these different operations with lists, but we never covered how to go through all the items at once. So to iterate through all the elements of a list, we could also use a for loop, but we wouldn't use the range method. Instead, we would do something like this. We would write for x in my list, and then colon, same thing, and we just do print x. Now this looks pretty similar to our method using range, except this time we don't need to use range because we're giving it our own variable, in this case, my list. So this loop header is basically saying, we're going to look through every single item in my list, and at each iteration, we're going to set that item equal to x. So then in the body, if we just print out x, we're actually going to end up printing out all the elements of the list. So for example, when the for loop starts, it's going to set x equal to oranges. And then we print that out, and then it goes back up here, it sets x equal to apples, then it prints that out, then it goes back up one more time, sets x equal to grapes, and then it prints that out. So we can actually run this, and you'll see it prints out oranges, apples, and grapes. So it actually does not matter how long this list is. If we run a for loop like this using this method, the number of times the loop will run is equal to the number of items in the list. So in this case, we have 3 fruits, so the loop is going to run 3 times. If I replace this list with a list of ints like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and run this loop, it'll run 5 times because there are 5 items. We can use this exact same type of for loop with tuples, sets, and dictionaries too. All we need to do is write for, and then we make up some variable name to represent each individual element, and then we're going to write in my list, or whatever your list variable name is. Once you do that, you just type a colon to let the computer know that you want to indent, and then whatever you want to do inside the loop body, you just write here. And like I said, we can do this with lists, sets, dictionaries, and tuples. But something really interesting about Python is you can actually do this with strings too. So let's say we have another variable. Let's just call it my string, and let's set it equal to, say, bananas. And I'll clear this output here. And instead of saying 4x in my list, I want to make it 4x in my string. And if you do it on a string, it'll actually loop through the string and it'll print out each individual character. Oops, didn't mean to switch those there. So if I run this, you'll see it prints out each individual letter, because instead of like a list, instead of taking each individual element separated by commas, if you pass in a string to this for loop, it'll treat every individual letter as each iteration. Okay, so now with for loops, you should have a decent understanding of the two types of ways that we use for loops. So the first way that I showed you was to use the range method. So we would do, like we had 4x in range, and we give it a range of numbers like 0 to 10, and then we would just indent, and then we would say print each individual element. So this is the first way that we did it, and that's just using a range of numbers. The second way that we can do it, I'll change this back to my list here. The second way that we can do it that I just showed you was, instead of giving it a range of numbers, to give it some variable that has multiple items in it. So that can be the collection data types we went over last episode. So list, sets, tuples, dictionaries, and like I just showed you, you can do it with strings. So these two ways here are pretty much the two ways that we're always going to use for loops in some way or another in Python. So now I want to move on to the second types of loops in Python. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this code block here, and I'll just open up a brand new one, just a clean one. So we're going to cover while loops next. So while loops are loops that run using a conditional statement. If you watched episode 3, you should be familiar with how general conditional statements work. So as long as a certain conditional statement is true, a while loop will continue to run. But as soon as it becomes false, this while loop will stop. So how do we actually write a while loop? So we would write it something like this. We would write while, then parentheses, and then inside of these parentheses, we put whatever we want our conditional statement to be. So let's write a little conditional statement inside of here. Let's write 1 less than 5. Then we're going to write a colon to let it know we're going to indent. So we're going to go into the body, and then let's just print something like LOL. So now I want you to see if you can find a problem with this loop here. I said that once a while loop reaches a false condition inside the parentheses, it's going to stop. But the issue inside of here is that 1 is always going to be less than 5 no matter what. So if we run it, this loop is going to infinitely print LOL because it's never going to stop. And I can actually show you. If I try and run it, it is literally just infinitely printing LOL, and it's never going to stop. So I should actually stop it before it crashes here. And I might actually, it'll let me stop it. So as you can see, infinite loops are really, really bad. And if you let them run long enough, they could crash your program and your entire computer. So that's why I went ahead and stopped this execution here. I'm going to go ahead and clear this out too. So the important thing about while loops is making sure that they have an in condition. So you have to make sure that this conditional statement right here will eventually be false. So let's make a condition inside these parentheses here that's actually going to eventually be false. So I want to make a new variable up here. I'm going to call it x, and I'm just going to set it equal to 0 to begin with. So instead of having 1 less than 5, I want to replace this 1 with an x. So our conditional while loop will run as long as x is less than 5. So what we need to do here to ensure this loop ends is that we need to increment x so that it will eventually be greater than 5 so that the loop will come to a halt. So we're going to use that same operator we showed earlier with doing plus equals to increment. So we're going to do x plus equals 1. And what this is essentially going to do when we trace this is we're going to start this program, set x equal to 0, and then we're going to look at this line and say, is 0 less than 5? Yes, it is, so we're going to enter the body. And the body is just going to increment x by 1. So now x is equal to 1. Then we say, is 1 less than 5? Yes, it is, so enter the body. Set x equal to 2 now because we increment by 1 more. Is 2 less than 5? Yes, run it again and again and again until eventually x is no longer less than 5. So I'm going to actually print out x here just so you can see. And if I run this block of code, you will see it prints off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And actually, I want to make a change to this. Instead of printing off x after I increment, I want to print out x before we increment, just so you can see this process a little bit more clearly. So we run it now, and now we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So like I said, we start at 0, and then this is true, so we go to the loop body, print 0, then we move x to 1. Then we go here, we print out 1, move x to 2, then we go here, print out 2, move x to 3, and so forth, until once we hit 5, so we're gonna, when we have 4 here, we print out x, and then we increment it to 5, and then we go back up to this header here, and we say, is 5 less than 5? No, it's not, so now we break the loop. And obviously this 5 here is just an arbitrary number that we just made up. If we wanted to increase the range, we could say x less than 20, and if we ran this, you'll see it prints every number pretty much from 0 to 20, but not including 20, because like I said, once x is equal to 20, we're not actually going to enter the body. So one thing I really want to note here is that if this while condition is never true in the first place, the while loop isn't going to run a single time. So I'm going to clear this output, and I'm going to change this to say x greater than 20. And if we run this, you'll see literally nothing happens. So it doesn't matter how many times we run it, nothing is going to happen. And why is that? Well, we set x equal to 0 at the very start, and then when we look at this line, we say, is 0 greater than 20? No, so we never even enter the while loop in the first place. So this while loop is never going to run, which is why if we run this code, nothing happens and it just runs instantly. But the difference is that when we have x less than 20, this initial statement at the very start of the program run is true, so that's how we enter the loop in the first place. So the biggest and most important thing about while loops in Python is being extra careful to make sure the loop cannot be infinite. So we have to make sure this conditional statement will eventually be false. If we don't and we're not careful, we'll be left with infinite loops, and those are something you never want to have in your program. So I showed you first when we had like a while 1 less than 5 in this conditional line here, but let's say we forget to increment x. If I delete this line here and forget to increment x, x is always going to be 0, so this is going to run forever. So if I run this, it should infinitely print out zeros, and I can show you like this. And it's just going to keep on printing this forever until eventually something's going to crash. So now that you've seen what to avoid with while loops, I want to do a little summary here. So I'm going to clear out this output here, and let's just make this x plus equals 1. We'll add this increment back in, so we have that there, just so it doesn't give us an error. So I want to do a little summary here between while loops and for loops. So what I showed you so far was how to use for loops in 2 different ways. So we did for x in range 0 to 10, and then we'll just say print x. And then what I showed you just before this was for x in my list. Let's say we have a list that we just make with oranges, apples, grapes. Then we can do that and then print x. And then this, what I just showed you just now, was how to use while loops. So these are the 3 main ways that you're gonna use loops in Python. So usually iterating through a range like this with a for loop, iterating through a list with a for loop, or iterating under some conditional with a while loop. So the main difference in functionality between the loops is this. So for loops are meant for when you have a list with a length that isn't going to change, or when you know exactly how many times you want to run a loop. While loops are used if you want to be a little more loose with your loops and only end once a certain condition is met. So this allows you to do a ton of things with while loops, but it also leaves you open to having infinite loops if you're not careful. So an application of while loops would be if you're programming a game, for instance. So let's say you have a Boolean called game started. If game started is true, it means the game is currently in progress. If game started is false, it means the game hasn't been started yet. So we could say while game started equals true, and then run whatever code runs the game. As soon as game started is false, meaning the game has ended, the while loop will stop and the game will stop running. So now that you should have a solid understanding of for loops and while loops, I want to go over 2 practice problems to solidify your understanding just a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and delete all this here and make a fresh code block so we can start with this first practice problem here. Okay, so let's say that we have a list right now. Let's just call it mylist1, and it's going to contain the values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, the prompt for this problem is that we want to make a new list called mylist2. I'm just going to comment this here. We want to have a new list, mylist2, that contains double all the values from mylist1. So we essentially want mylist2 to look like this. We want 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, because essentially what we're doing is just doubling each of these elements from list 1. But we want to do this without actually just initializing it like this. Because what if the values in mylist1 change? So what if we change this to like 3, 6, 9, and whatever? We want what these to reflect accurately to say, 6, 12, and then 18. So we always just want these list 2 values to be double what is in list 1. So I'll go ahead and fix these here, and I'll make these corresponding again. Okay, so first, just to start off, I want to initialize mylist2 as just an empty list, just to show that it's empty for now and that we're going to add to it later. So how would we go about solving this problem by using a loop? With all programming problems, you should first just take a second to actually break down the problem and think about how you might do this. So let's think about this from a practical perspective. So I said we want to go through each of the elements in mylist1 and double them, and then add that element to mylist2. So what we're really trying to do is loop through all the items in mylist1, at every item, multiply it by 2, and then use the .append method that we learned last episode to add this number to mylist2. So for example, at the first element of mylist1, we would just double it and then use the append method to add to mylist2. Then we go to the next element, double this, and we append to add 4, and so forth. So let's go ahead and write a loop for that. So I already showed you how to use a for loop to loop through a list. So let's write this. Let's say for item in mylist1, and then we're going to write a colon to indent. And then inside the body, what we want to do is take each individual element, which is represented by item, and then you want to multiply it by 2 and then add it to mylist2. So we can actually do that in one line, and I'll show you, and I'll go ahead and go over this and explain it if you don't understand it right away. So I'm going to write mylist2.append, and this mylist2.append you should have learned in the last episode when we went over how to add elements to a list. So this is just basically going to add an individual number to mylist2. And inside of this parentheses here, what we want to do is we want to take the element from mylist1 and then just multiply it by 2. So let's do item times 2. And the reason we do items times 2 is because item represents each individual element in mylist1. So essentially what we're doing is just taking each element, we're multiplying it by 2, and then we're just calling this append method to add it to mylist2. So if I actually go to the very bottom here and I print out mylist2, it should print out 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, because we are just doubling all of these values. And yep, you can see it prints out 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Let's say we want to change the values in mylist1. Let's do this to 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25. And now if we run it, you'll see it prints out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, because it is still double all of the values from mylist1. So I get that if you're brand new to Python, this code might be just a little bit overwhelming or confusing to understand at first, so don't get caught up if you don't quite understand what's going on right away. I strongly encourage you to hop into your own Google Colab notebook of your own and just mess around with this Python code. Maybe just copy and paste what I have and just try out some new things. The best way to test your understanding of a concept is to build it yourself, so try messing around with lists and for loops and just see what you can do. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all this here, and I want to move on to our second practice problem. So I'm going to delete this cell, open up a new one, and our second practice problem is going to contain while loops. So let's say we want to make a fun little mini game. We want to build a super basic number guessing game. We'll have a number between 0 and 10 that is the correct number, and we'll prompt the user to take a guess. If the guess is correct, the program will stop. If the guess is incorrect, the program will keep running. Let's build the guessing functionality first. So I'm going to start off by making a variable name called correct number. So let's say correct number, and we said we wanted it to be something 0 through 10. Let's just set it equal to 7 to start off. And this will represent the number that we need to guess correctly. So the correct guess would be 7. So let's also make a variable called user input. And this is going to represent whatever the user inputs into the keyboard. So this is going to be basically what their guess is. So we're going to do user input equals input. Let's just type, please enter a number from 0 to 10. And if you remember in episode 3, we used this input function before. And if you're not familiar, what it basically does is just prompts the user with some text. So we say, please create a number from 0 to 10. And then it opens up a little text box and the user can type something in and then press enter. And just like last time, I'm going to wrap this whole thing in a int parentheses here, so that we can ensure that whatever the user enters is always going to be an integer. So far we have correct number, which is just 7, and then we're storing our user number in user input. So now what? So now we need to write a conditional statement that checks if the number the user typed, in other words, user input, matches the correct number, which is just correct number variable. So let's write a conditional. Let's write if user input equals correct number. And then inside of this if statement, I just want to print, let's say you guessed the number correctly. But what if the user guesses incorrectly? For that, we'll use an else statement. So let's say else, and then we'll just print, let's say you did not guess correctly. So now let's just run this program so I can show you kind of how this works. So I'm going to run it and it's going to prompt us. It's going to say, please enter a number from 0 to 10. So we know that the correct number is 7. So let's enter something intentionally wrong like 5. So when we enter 5, what's going to happen is we hit this if statement. We're going to say, is 5 equal to 7? Nope. So we enter the else statement and it's going to print off, you did not guess correctly. So we can see that our conditional here is working just fine. Let's test actually guessing the correct number now. Let's say we input 7, and yep, it'll say you guessed the number correctly. So we can tell our conditional works just fine, but this isn't entirely what we want. Remember that we said that we wanted the program to keep running until the correct number is guessed. Right now, we'll only run the program one time because we don't have any kind of loop or anything. So this is where a while loop would come in. So we know that a while loop has to run based on a conditional statement that'll either be true or false. So let's make some space up here, and I'm going to make a new Boolean. I'm just going to call it gameActive and set it equal to true. And what this is going to mean is that if this value is true, if gameActive is true, then that means that the game is still going on. If it is false, that will mean the game has stopped. In other words, if the user guesses the incorrect number, this variable should stay true. If the user guesses the correct number, we'll want to change this Boolean to false so that the game ends. So let's go ahead and write a while loop now. So I'm going to actually move this up. I'm going to cut and paste this up here at the top. And inside of our loop, we're going to want to have all of these lines of code because we're going to want to say at each iteration, the user will take a guess and then we'll check, is it correct or is it not correct? And we don't want to have these two lines inside the loop because these want to be initialized before the loop starts. So let's just go ahead. Let's fix some of the spacing here. And let's just write a while loop. So we want to say while game active. And this is essentially the same as saying while game active equals true. But because it's a Boolean, we can just write it like this. And what we want to do actually is we want to indent all of this code inside of the while loop because we want it to run at every single iteration. So I'm going to highlight all of this and then press tab. So now we have one thing left to add. So if the user guesses the correct number, which is represented by this if statement, we're going to need to add a line that updates gameActive to be false. Because we said if the user guesses the correct number, we want to end the game. So we need to break the while loop. So under this print line, I'm just going to make a line here that says gameActive equals false. And make sure again that we're capitalizing these F's and T's on false and true. So once this line is changed to false, we will not continue to run this loop because the while loop is only going to run while gameActive is true. And if the guess is incorrect, we don't need to change game active at all because it'll still be true. So let's run this code a few times. So we press run and it prompts us for a number from 0 to 10. So let's do an incorrect guess. Let's say 2. Oh, well, we didn't guess correctly, so it's going to prompt us again. Let's say we put 9. And that was another incorrect guess, sorry, so it prompts us again. Let's say 6. That's incorrect, so it keeps prompting us. And then once we input 7, which is the correct number, it should say you guessed the number correctly, and then the program halts, so we don't get prompted again for input. And let's actually try this again. Let's change the correct number. Let's say correct number this time is going to be 4. So let's rerun this, and let's just guess some incorrect numbers first. Let's get 7. That's incorrect, so it prompts us again. Let's do 9. Incorrect, so it prompts us again. Let's do 5. Incorrect, so it prompts us again. And then let's finally do 4. And then it prints out, you guessed the number correctly, and the program ends. So just like with the for loop section and the other practice problem, this practice problem might look a bit daunting if you're not super familiar with loops just yet. And obviously it takes time, so I'd highly encourage you to go into your own Google Colab notebook and just copy and paste this code and just mess around with loops as much as you want. Just try with while loops, try with for loops, and just see what you can do with Python. So hopefully now you should have a decent understanding of how loops work in Python. So in this video, we went over for loops and while loops. You learned how to use for loops to iterate through a certain set of numbers and also through a list. Then you learned how to use while loops to keep running as long as a certain condition is met. Then we went over 2 practice problems to solidify your understanding of each type of loop. With your knowledge so far of loops, conditionals, variables, and collection data types, you should actually now be able to build almost any Python program that you want, as you now know the bread and butter behind Python functionality. In the next 2 episodes, though, we'll cover functions and classes, which will both make your life a ton easier when building your own programs. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next video.